Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Ages of Chaos. Now, as I said last time, this one's going to be a slightly heavy-hearted one. We do like, in the Fluff and Hammer, we do like to keep things enthusiastic, we do like to keep things positive, because, quite frankly, the new Games Workshop, as they are, is absolutely wonderful. We have very little but praise for them, and the products they've been putting out are amazing. But it wasn't always the case, sadly. Now, before we get on to the transition from 2nd Ed 40k to 3rd Ed 40k, and therefore the 3rd Ed Chaos Codex, which, well, you'll see. There is something we need to talk about in Fantasy Battle, because there was yet another Realms of Chaos boxed set. Another big, massive box set with a massive stonking book in it, which was sort of made to coincide with an entirely new miniatures line. You had, and most of them were metal, interestingly. They were made to coincide, it was made to coincide with what were then the new Greater Demon sculpts, which, although they look dinky by comparison to what's been put out at the moment, they were fantastic back then. They were huge, for one thing. They were some of the biggest metal miniatures you could get. I think the two that had come out at that point were the Great Unclean one and the Lord of Change, and they were beautiful. I mean, they look a bit old hat now, but they were absolutely stunning. You also had, for the first time, metal demon princes. You had there hadn't actually ever been a miniature for demon princes up until that point, not a standardized miniature. But back then there was a blister pack that had a sort of multi-part metal demon prince in it. You had metal nurglings, you had you had command options released for the various demons for the first time. So you didn't just have regiments of demons anymore. You had demon champions, you had demon standard bearers and demon musicians and things like that, which have remained standard. I mean, you have that now. That's just part of how demons work, but back then it wasn't. That was the first time it was introduced. Now, the box itself is really interesting. It's actually a really good box set. It's a very good book, and it moves the story of Chaos on significantly in the old world. The book contains no special characters at all. None whatsoever, which was really rare at the time. Instead, what they did were, because there were so many Chaos characters, because Chaos, what they standardized in this book was the fact that Chaos was made out of detachments. So the way it worked was you could take demon detachments, which were led by either a demon prince or a greater demon. You could take mortal detachments, which were led by champion sorcerers and consisted of chaos warriors or whatever. Or you could take beast detachments, which largely consisted of beastmen, dragon ogres, trolls, that kind of thing. Or you could mix and match them all together. It was one of those books that was really variable. It was very, very cool. You could apply gifts of the various gods and of Chaos Undivided to your greater demons, to your demon princes, to your champions. You had lots of different random elements and random tables. It was a really cool piece of work. But what was really interesting was the way it moved the story of Chaos on. This was one of the earliest instances in which you have some of the core northern tribes described, like the Kurgan, for example. But it's also the first time that you have a coalescence of the background around particular figures. So this is the instance in which Archaon is introduced. You had this separate book released alongside the Realms of Chaos box set, which was called Champions of Chaos. And Champions of Chaos, I think, contain 9 different Chaos characters, most of which have gone the way of the dodo now. Most of them aren't in the background anymore, or they've been swiftly done away with. You had Archaon for the first time. His original miniature, which was not that impressive, it has to be said. Valnir the Reaper, who doesn't exist anymore. Count Mordric the Damned, who doesn't exist anymore. Scylla and Fingrim, who doesn't... Scylla actually does still exist. Scylla is one of the very, 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 very few characters that still exists in AOS now, and has had multiple different incarnations. You have Egrim Van Horstman, which is one of the very first Chaos miniatures I ever bought and painted and put together. Zeechan Chaos Sorcerer on the back of a big double-headed Chaos Dragon. Had a very ignominious end in the end times. He tried to contain the wind of light, and it blew him apart. So he's gone. He's absolutely dead. You had the Slaneshi demon prince Azazel. You had Azazel, who I love. I absolutely love Azazel, but nope, he's not in the background anymore. And one or two others. Oh, Amon Shakai. Amon Shakai, the greater demon of Zeech, the Lord of Change. He's not in the background anymore either. So most of them have gone away. But for the first time, you have this notion of the arch messiah of chaos, sort of the equivalent of Abaddon, basically, in fantasy battle, gathering together the various tribes and forces of chaos and uniting them under his banner. It was such a big event that they did this wonderful thing in White Dwarf where they had, it was sort of like the Arena of Champions, where they had special characters from all the different armies fighting together, and then they threw in a wild card, which was a bloodthirster. And back then, greater demons in general were like uber gods. They were at least the equivalent of special characters or dragons, and if not worse than that. And ironically, it was the bloodthirster that won. I think the last round it had to fight against Nagash, I believe, and it won. The Bloodthirster killed all of them. So the greatest character in Warhammer at the time wasn't a character, it was a Bloodthirster. So there you go. But yeah, the book is fantastic. It has real character. It has a lot of this for the first time since the Realms of Chaos days, it has these wonderful border artwork that really, it's very twisted and very occult and very organic and gives you a feel for what's going on. The miniatures range at the time was fantastic. Oh, I missed the character Gore Thor. Of course I missed the character Gore Thor, who is no longer in the background, but Gore Thor was a really significant character at one time. Gore Thor is the Beastman equivalent of Archaon. So he's like the messiah of the Beastmen. He's a Beastman who is actually not limited by his intelligence or by tribalism. He's actually very, very clever and works to unite the Beastmen against the forces of order. Lovely miniature as well. He used to ride around on a chariot and used to have this big helmet made out of the skull of a monster. Gorgeous, gorgeous miniature. Great character. No longer in the background, sadly. I'd love to see Gore Thor come back. Really, really would. Loved Gore Thor. Oh, and Arbal the Undefeated. There was also Arbal the Undefeated for Khorne, who was a Khornate Chaos Warrior champion who used to ride around on the back of a very big fleshhound. And if he ever broke in the game, if he ever fled, he was automatically turned into a Chaos Spawn because Khorne punished him, which was really cool. Really cool. Lots of character in that book. It was a good time to be a Chaos player in Fantasy Battle at that time. And that was sort of in the midst of 2nd Ed 40k, and I think it was 5th Ed Fantasy Battle. It was like well on by that point. But yes, what we principally want to talk about here is, it's sadly one of the more negative factors. The transition from 2nd Ed 40k to 3rd Ed 40k wasn't necessarily a bad thing. It was very traumatic because it was massively different. They really wanted to remove the game from what it was. So it went from being like this very complicated pseudo RPG skirmish game to being a very, very quick, pacey, punchy war game, which is more or less what it is now. I mean, the 3rd Ed rules, they didn't change for a long time, not significantly. It wasn't really up until 8th edition that a bigger transition came about. But the transition from 2nd Ed to 3rd Ed was quite traumatic, obviously, because it meant that everyone's codexes were invalidated overnight. And it also meant that everyone's army lists were invalidated overnight. So the transition was quite painful. What Games Workshop were doing, they started to release codices very, very, very quickly. It was like one a month. Very much like it is for 8th Ed, but for 8th Ed, they've planned it out. Clearly, they planned it out and everything is working. But for 3rd Ed, it wasn't. It clearly wasn't. And one of the first, after the Space Marine Codex, one of the first codices to hit was the original 3rd Ed Chaos Codex, or as people fondly remember it, they don't call it Codex Chaos, they call it Pamphlet Chaos, because that's what it was. It was tiny. It was this ridiculous, very, very thin book. Awful cover. I mean genuinely awful artwork in this book, which attempted to port over a lot of the stuff that occurred in 2nd Ed to 3rd Ed with a minimal of fuss. Unfortunately, it was rushed out the door, and that is very, very, very clear. There are so many problems in it. There are so many problems in this book. You have situations whereby you can do things like, say you have a Plague Marine unit. You can give the Plague Champion the Mark of Khorne, or the Mark of Slaanesh, or the Mark of Tzeentch. Say you have a Chaos Lord with the Mark of Khorne leading an army of Khorne Berserkers. All the Khorne Berserkers are fearless, so they'll never run away, but the Chaos Lord isn't. The Chaos Lord can run away. It's absolute nonsense. It is such a badly thought out book. It was so badly thought out that there are even units missing from it, like Cult Terminators, for example. You couldn't get Terminators with a Mark of Chaos back then. So what they had to do, the month it was released, they actually had to do an Index Astartes article in White Dwarf fixing all of these problems. And then the month after, they did an entire page worth of errata for it because it was so badly put together. You had things like Demon Princes of Tzeentch being able to take psychic powers which they couldn't fucking cast because they had 0 ballistic skill. And back then, psychic powers were weapons. They relied upon your ballistic skill to hit. So they couldn't use them. Absolute insanity. The book was an absolute mess, and people hated it. People absolutely loathed it. Now, one thing that did happen, and that it did lead to, which was a very positive turn, I feel, was the creation of the Index Astartes articles, which were articles that featured in White Dwarf on a monthly basis, and each of them featured one of the Space Marine Legions. They introduced the full background for the Space Marine Legions, and also special rules for them. And that was a very positive thing because it led to this wonderful elaboration of both the Chaos Legions and the Loyalist Legions. We got some real cool background on them and some excellent special rules, it has to be said, which in turn led to something really, really cool, which is the 3.5 Codex. The third Ed Chaos Codex was so unpopular that in the midst of 3rd edition, they completely revamped Chaos. They completely overhauled it, and they used that overhaul as an excuse to introduce one of the first global campaigns, which was the Eye of Terror campaign. The 3.5 Codex is as far removed from the original 3.0 Codex as you can possibly imagine. It's very fondly remembered, not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. It's massively overcomplicated with designations for weapons and gifts and rules and all of this nonsense. But what it has is a lot of heart. A lot of heart. It actually feels, although it's much thinner, it actually feels more like the Realms of Chaos books in terms of the amount of customization you can get out of it. It's a really cool book, and was a very, 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 very high point indeed for Chaos players. Chaos players still love it. Still absolutely love it. Because it crystallized a lot of notions. It was really built around the Black Legion and around Abaddon the Despoiler. You really, apart from the supplementary army lists for the different cults and for the different legions, all of which are included in the Codex, by the way, it's really, the core army list is built around the Black Legion, and that's very, very evident. It's very overt. It's a beautiful book. It's got so much flavour and so much character that for a time, every other army was a Chaos army. There were so many Chaos armies being collected back then that they kind of shunted out many of the other armies. Everybody was collecting a different Chaos force because it was so various. Every legion played differently. Khorne Berserkers played significantly differently from Thousand Sons. Thousand Sons played significantly differently from Emperor's Children. Emperor's Children played significantly differently from Night Lords, and so on and so forth. There was a problem with balance. The Codex was not internally balanced. It was not balanced again. It was a totally different format from all of the other codices out there, which was a great shame. A great shame because it kind of shone an unflattering light on the other codices. It demonstrated how poorly put together they were. And as a result, it was just the best codex, which was a problem in competitive terms, especially given that certain legions were just better than the others. Iron Warriors were insane back then. Iron Warriors could put out so much raw ordnance and firepower. It was ridiculous. Emperor's Children. Emperor's Children were absolute nightmares back then. You could put together monstrosities. You could put together demon princes from the army list back then of Slanesh that would make Magnus and Mortarion, as they are now, look like grotlings. Basically, it was one of the core problems of the Codex was that it was massively abusable, but one of its benefits was that it just delved so deeply into the lore of the Chaos Space Marines, and it really it entrenched and enshrined this notion that they are ancient. These guys have been fighting for so long, and that they even the ones, even like the new recruits, like the renegades and whatnot, they have been every waking moment is combat. It's competition. It's a kind of Darwinian tribalism. They are refined in the way of combat in a way that even the Imperial Space Marines are not, because they have to fight. Every moment is paranoia. They're fighting against everyone. They're fighting against their subordinates. They're fighting against their commanders. They are trying to establish themselves in this condition where only the most ruthless and capable survive. It is absolutely brilliant. It is an absolutely wonderful status quo. You have the introduction of things like the Defiler, demon engines, the very first big demon engine in 40k. You have the Defiler. You have things like the background of the Raptors, which would eventually split into the Warp Talons as well, becoming cohered and much more interesting, much more fascinating than it used to be. You have so much going on in that book. If you haven't got a copy of it, go and get it. Go and find a second-hand copy and have a read, because it is absolutely stunning. And sadly, I mean, for my money, it was the last really good Chaos Codex before the advent of 8th Ed. And that's a very sad thing, because that meant that we had years and years and years without a decent Chaos Codex. One of the other things they introduced at this point were lots of other special characters. You had Typhus. This codex sees the introduction of Typhus for the Death Guard, and his sort of coalescence is a core part of the background. Lucius the Eternal is introduced for the first time in this book. You have things like... one of the big things in this codex, they very shortly after they introduced the Eye of Terror Codex, and the Eye of Terror Codex was an actual campaign book. This was one of the first times they ran a really big campaign that they proclaimed was going to change the background of the 40k universe significantly depending on the outcome. It didn't, by the way. By all accounts, Chaos just won. Chaos just won that campaign, but because they didn't want to change the status quo, they retconned it so that Chaos didn't win. Basically, it's really frustrating, which is something they don't do now, by the way. They've learnt their lesson, so all kudos to Games Workshop on that one. They introduced the Eye of Terror campaign, which had like divergent army lists for established armies. So you had for Chaos, you had the Lost and the Damned, which were all mutants and cultists and beast men and that kind of thing. For the Space Wolves, you had the Wolfen, which are now obviously part of the core army list, which had only just returned at that point, by the way. The Wolfen returned from their sojourn in the Eye of Terror to combat Chaos, specifically to combat Chaos. You had a specific Imperial Guard regiment whose name I can't recall off the top of my head, and you also had Ulthwé Strike Forces for the Ulthwé Craft world, which was a very fast Elder army that could deploy very quickly. It lacked some of the specialist units like Aspect Warriors, but it was really quick and very, very strong indeed. It was so much fun. That era of Games Workshop was what got me back into the hobby after the disappointment of Third Ed, and I was only a kid at the time. I was like 19, 20. I just started university, so I for the first time ever, really, I had my own money. So I had the money to spend, and it was the first time I really started to get into the hobby. I went berserk. I started painting a Black Legion army. I started painting a Word Bearers army. I started painting Thousand Sons and Death Guard, and so many different armies. It was ridiculous. I went berserk back then. I do distinctly recall getting a Keeper of Secrets, the original metal one, the old metal one, painting it up and just being in love with it. One of the first miniatures I was really proud of, and then it broke to bits and I lost it somewhere. I can't believe that. I wish I still had it. I so wish I still had it. But Yeah, I mean, this actually hasn't been as negative a video as I thought it was going to be. The third Ed Chaos Codex, the original one, worth owning as an historical curio. If you could get it for cheap, get it and compare it to what's around now, and you will be flabbergasted at how bad it is. By contrast, pick up the 3.5 Codex and you'll think, wow, that is a stunner. That's an absolutely stunning piece of work. Sadly, as we'll explore in the next video, then the next video is going to probably be the most negative in this entire run, so prepare yourselves. It may even be a bit of a rant, to be honest. It may be a bit of a rant. What they did following the 3.5 Codex, because the 3.5 Codex was so dominant, rather than rewrite the other codices to bring them up to its level, they actually completely gutted Chaos for the next Codex, and I mean gutted it. You have no idea. Next time, we'll explore Codex Chaos Space Marines 4.0 and Codex Chaos Demons. It's going to be fun. It's going to be a rant, I guarantee you. So, until next time, ladies and gents, bye-bye!